Hello, hello. Welcome to the InScope podcast. My name is John Scott. I am the CEO and co-founder of ScopeStack, where we solve all of your IT services scoping problems. All right. So I'll be your host today. Extremely excited to have our guest, Stephen Madick. I had the pleasure of working for him at Dimension Data a while back. And he's, Stephen, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you here, sir.
Hey, John, how are you?
Good, man. So for those of you who don't know, Stephen, started out at Nexus IS, came to Dimension Data where he was responsible for running pretty much the entire pre-sales team at Dimension Data at the time when I left. And then most recently was at Presidio running the team in the West. And so, I've seen him build pre-sales teams. I've been under his leadership. And so couldn't think of a better person to have here to talk about what does it look like to build a pre-sales team and measure success? So again, thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, awesome. So happy to be here and so excited for you with ScopeStack and how all those things have come together for you since last you worked for me. So
I know, man.
You've done a great job.
You were asking me earlier if I ever knew I'd be a celebrity, and I had no idea, right? But look what happened, right? So we're all here.
Things we end up doing in life that we don't anticipate.
I know. Who would have
thought?
And
you're right. The fun that I've had in sort of my career is really that I got the chance to work at Nexus, which was really a startup. We had zero in sales when I first got there. And so taking that organization and building that organization from nothing, certainly with an amazing team and great leadership around us, to an organization that was at $600 million to then be acquired by Dimension Data /NTT, that then gave me the opportunity to run North America and help build some process and tools and hire great people to join that organization. That was fantastic. And then, sort of getting to that age where you decided that you wanted to really kind of step back and maybe spend a little more time with the kids. It took on that Western region opportunity and took that organization and built up a pretty nice organization again. So it was different. Each of those scenarios has been different in that building process. And I think that's something that, as we talk about this topic, John, I think we'll find that that maturity of where you are in that spectrum is really important to determine how do you go about building the organization.
Yeah, and I want to get into all those details with you, right? Because again, I know you have the experience and you've lived it, right? This is not something that's just theoretical that you've written a book, but you've actually been there, done it. So it's so funny because I think about, I was talking to another upcoming podcast guest, and I keep talking to these people, and there's this legacy, right, of people that worked at Data at one point or another, and like, oh, when did you work there? When did you work there? And so, again, I had a great opportunity to work there and had some, great leaders there. But all right, so let's get started, right? So you mentioned, building a pre-sales team, and you mentioned like the first thing, I think it's the first thing, is really understanding like the maturity of your services business. Is that really where it all starts when you're building a pre-sales team?
Yeah, I think there's a few key considerations. It's really important that the executive leadership team has the vision and the understanding of where they are and the awareness of where they are in that maturity cycle. Some organizations are, very focused in one area versus another area. And that can be across many different spectrums. It might be that, hey, I'm very focused in a certain technology. It might be that I'm very focused in a certain vertical. It might be that I'm very focused in a certain market. But one of the key considerations is, how am I wanting to go to market? And that is something that I think oftentimes gets a little lost as you begin to build, or can get lost as you begin to build. It doesn't necessarily mean that a small organization can't act like a big one, that a big one can't act like a small one. But really having that executive level and leadership awareness is really key to how you go about building out an organization.
Sure. And is that your responsibility, again, having been to some of these organizations, is really distilling what that leadership vision, the corporate vision, kind of go to market and converting that into, okay, well, this is what we need to do for this team. And as I build this, so is that your job as a pre-sales leader, is to really convert vision, values, kind of go to market to this team and kind of your strategy within it?
Yeah, it's to help make sure you have alignment from executive vision all the way through to actual filled action.
Got it.
And there are a multitude of steps that, and tiers that are within that, from vision to action scenario. So, as you think about what the role of either at an SVP level or CTO level or director or manager level is, to really make sure that they've codified what the business expectations are so that they can deliver a consistent message to the team and to ultimately to your client base, right? So that you can ensure that what you say you're going to deliver is what you deliver.
Yeah.
So understanding where you are on that spectrum, like we talked about in that maturity cycle, you might find yourself that you're saying, hey, I'm really good at deploying XYZ technology. And I guess we could just say something so we have something to kind of hang our hat on.
Yeah.
I'm really good at wireless deployments.
There we go.
That's great. And now you want to build out a pre-sales organization to support that expertise that you have. Well, there's a whole number of ways to do that. You could begin as simply as taking some of the post-sales expertise that you have and saying, well, now you're going to kind of dual role. You could take some of those post-sales experts and say, you know what, I'm going to segment you. You're going to now do post-sales. You're going to do pre-sales. Mm-hmm. And those are some of the fundamental questions that you have to begin to ask yourself. Because as you begin to make these decisions, what you'll see, what you'll find as an organization is there are limitations that become something that you have to then deal with. But there are also advantages that you get to have by doing some of these things. And that's why organizations ultimately go down these different paths, right? Is they want to capture and harness the advantages that they have by segmenting or building out a pre-sales organization. I'll give you another quick thought, which is, let's say you're in wireless and that's where your expertise lies. And now you've, for whatever reason, decided to get into cloud or let's make it an easier one, maybe just a tangible voice communications.
There you go.
So you might not be the expert today in voice communication, but it's an area of opportunity. So a way of going about saying you're going to step into that business could be to incubate that business, which means that I'm going to take my business focus and I'm going to say, rather than having a whole a decentralized model of design, assess, design, deploy, manage, and maintain, I'm going to bring that team and make it a singular team. Yeah. A lot of organizations do that today, and they do that for a number of different reasons. But ultimately, what then has to happen at some point as you go on this journey is you want to start pushing that down into the organization so that it becomes just normal part of the sales engagement, as opposed to a separate thing that you do as part of your sales engagement. You might hear about this in an organization where somebody says, oh, well, that's that team that does that, right? Or she or he is the overlay that I need to bring in to have this conversation. And that's a disruptor in your sales engagement and the way you go to market.
I was going to say, I'm used to that, again, having worked at some of the same organizations you had because of our size, right? There was, in order to incubate that skill set or whatever, it made sense to start with a person or a smaller group of people who then spread that skill set and capability across the entire sales team, right? And so it was really hard to have one person for every area or one person per SE and stuff. So you do to a certain point have to scale that, right? It's not always overlay and stuff like that. But is that all is that all because of the size of an organization? You could probably get away with having a wireless person and a security person and a collaboration person in a smaller business, wouldn't you think? And is it?
So that's a great point. And you can, to a degree, and again, it gets back to that executive awareness and vision as to where do you want to take your business. Some of the things that become really important, and this actually is something that lends itself so nicely to what you do, what ScopeStack does, is in order to scale, if that is what the business executive leadership chooses to do, what the business desires are, you have to have the right tools and process in place in order to do that kind of scale. So I'll give you a quick, easy example. If I've decided that I want to now have some element of pre-sales in my business, what begins to be a consideration is how expert are those pre-sales resources in actually, the thing that I'm now asking my deployment team to execute upon when that pre-sales resource has done their work. So the more that you can have some standardized, normalized type of information available. I used to call this artificial intelligence. When we took what we were doing in Excel, we used to call it quote gen. Thank you, Mike Hyman. We used to call it quote gen, and we would cut and paste all of our information, our tasks, all the things that you needed, the resource type and the hours associated with those tasks. That was tedious and wrought for failure and wrong. You cut something and put it in the wrong line item, and it was horrible.
But I mean, that was advanced for our time, though, right? Like, right. It wasn't until brilliant people such as my team was able to build it. But that was advanced stuff, right, back then, right? Spreadsheets and like being able to generate just a snippet of text, So again, keep going. Sorry.
No, because you're bringing up great points, and it is exactly true, right? That was advanced for that time, and yet what we found is that still, on average, the time from understanding a customer's requirements to putting something on paper was excruciating long. And then once even that was done, of course, then the post-sales team's like, well, wait a minute, what did you mean by this? Or what is this task? I've never seen this thing before. Or, wow, I don't take that many hours to get that thing done. Or, hey, I'm never going to rack and stack. I'm a triple CCIE. I'm not doing that stuff. Use a different resource. So you have to, in order to scale, the executive team, the management team, they have to decide how do they want to go through that scaling process. And that is generally not only through standardization of policy and people and structure of organization, but it also is tools and process. So, and this is why it's so important to understand where you are in the maturity cycle. I'll give you one other quick example in terms of building an organization. I know we'll keep going back to this, but let's say you're really strong in a market like Southern California or New York City. Whatever, you take a major metropolitan.
The two most expensive ones in the country.
Okay, we'll talk about, how about like Kansas City, Missouri? There we go.
There you go. All right.
I love them all. I have, I've been up and down everywhere. So, but you take a market where you're really strong in, you've got a great core competency of, let's say, even all technologies in that market and the resources that support all that. Well, now you got a client who says, hey, John, I'm not only in Kansas City, Missouri, but I actually have an office in Gulfport, Mississippi. That's where some of my decision makers are. Could you put some of your resources there? All right. So how do you go about, knowing where you are from a maturity standpoint, building out and putting somebody who's now sort of a satellite person? That's not that hard necessarily in the physical and logistics aspect of it. But how do you ensure that, for lack of a better description, you're getting the same McDonald's, Mac from the Gulfport, Mississippi team that your Kansas City, Missouri team produces. Right?
Yeah, and they're not on an island by themselves, and they're doing things the corporate way as opposed to their individual way in Mississippi, right? So that's what we would typically find with even some of these again, spreadsheet type models and teams that are spread out all over the place is, you don't talk to anyone else, right? And so it's Jimmy's voice in Mississippi as opposed to the larger organization's voice and how you do things and how you go to market. So completely agree.
It's a great point. How do you maintain the culture? How do you make sure that, as an example, you typically, as you're building a market, you may extend resources out from the core location. So just imagine if you're building your pre-sales organization and now your pre-sales engineers are responsible for everything that this other team in the Kansas City, Missouri area is responsible for, like how many hours of project management are going to go into this, specific opportunity? How many hours of this technology expertise or this expertise? And what you find is that if you don't infuse through process, tools, policy, and other means, the understanding of how to build that specific design, labor estimation, and scope in that Gulfport, Mississippi, in this example, location, you're going to find a disjointed, misunderstood, frustrated post-sales team.
Yeah, right.
And that's not good.
Well, and I think what a lot of people will do is they'll say, oh, well, the way we do things in Mississippi are different. And it's not... I don't know why we're picking on Mississippi all of a sudden, but we are. But like, it's not the fact that you're doing them differently. It's that you're using a different resource rate. So like maybe your costing's different in Mississippi, right? But the execution of those services is no different regardless of where you are. I don't care if you're in Prague, right? It doesn't matter, right? The one thing that does matter is the pricing to be competitive as well as the costing associated to a resource there locally, right? So it's not, again, I'm repeating myself for like the third time. It is not different. The way you do things is not different, right? The way you price them is different.
Yeah, no, it's a really good observation, and certainly, of course, because you're in the business, you get that. And
sorry, I got a little passionate there for a second.
We love passion. Passion's good.
I know, right?
One of the things that I recognized I was doing, we were building out a tool for pricing labor and developing scopes for, I don't know if I can actually say it. I'm sorry. And they're a global organization.
Right.
And so what we found was that there was a lot of conversation and discussion around, well, how do I handle currency changes? How do I handle, resource types in these, South Africa or in the African nations or in Canada or LATAM or wherever it was? And what got missed oftentimes, to your point, the task of the doing is the same in every country. The currency, the exchange rate, where resources are located, how narrow the streets are, whether there's an elevator or not, how easy it is to get to waste disposal. All of those things can be demonstrably different.
Sure.
But the task itself is still the same. So how do you, in building your pre-sales organization, account for these things that you have to infuse into these pre-sales folks to know so that when they hand this off to their post-sales counterparts, they're not doing what most post-sales folks oftentimes believe that, hey, I just got handed what's the easy way to say this? A pile of poop
stuff,
doo-doo, on purpose.
Right.
You didn't get handed a pile of doo-doo on purpose. That's not how pre-sales individuals think. So,
and that's a topic you and
I. It's important to understand all that. Yeah, we can talk about doo-doo in another topic.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast. All right, so just kind of to bring this back full circle, right? So you're building a pre-sales team. You've been there, you've done this. So like, how are you as a leader of a pre-sales team? Are you measuring the success? Like, how are you being measured as a leader? Again, you're reporting into CEOs and owners of businesses, and you're like, hey, this is your great idea, Madick, to build a pre-sales team. Like, what are they looking for from you? And then how are you measuring success for your business? And can you maybe help navigate that for some of our listeners? And because that's a tricky one, right? There could potentially be a lot of nuance to how you measure and things. But what have you seen be successful?
There are so many nuances, and this is where you can really destroy a pre-sales organization, because if you don't have good alignment between expectation at the executive level down through your management and then out to the field, it doesn't really matter how great your products are or how great your deployment team is or anything else. Everything gets lost because what you can find, and I've been in these organizations where I've stepped into this role and I've seen this. As an example, you might be tasking the director level or the SVPs to manage to EBITDA, or maybe they're managing to gross margin from an actual standpoint, so from a deployment standpoint.
Right.
Well, when you're in the pre-sales arena and now you're telling your field level engineers, your pre-sales engineers, hey, we're going to compensate you based on how many scopes you write and how accurate they are, or how many clients you see in a week, or whatever it is. If you have this misalignment,
right,
you're not going to achieve the goals, because you're going to have your management pushing on the pre-sales resources in the field to do something that gets your management their bonus. But the pre-sales field guys and gals are all going to be focused on what it is that gets them their bonus. So you have misalignment. And I bring that up because one of the key things that often gets overlooked is compensation and the drivers of compensation and what that means and how that translates, right?
Yeah.
And there's this tug of war that you find in most organizations, and this is what can create a bit of a schism, to your point about key metrics, is you get this mismatch. but it's supposed to be a healthy tension, right? You're supposed to have some things at the leadership level that are different, right, than what you have at the field level, obviously. Right. So, as an example, and this also is really important about what tools you have. So, let's say I want to measure how many scopes get written in a monthly basis by an engineer, which, by the way, I think is a measurement you should have. And I'll caveat all of this by saying there is no one measurement, and there's not even necessarily a collective of measurements that should always be your guiding sort of star as to how you treat your engineers. We're humans at first. Yeah. And I think that sometimes gets lost when you start looking at this data and the metrics, to the chagrin of the field engineers and to the detriment of the business itself.
No, I mean, it's a great point, right? Because, like, again, I don't know if a lot of people, I think if you're listening to the podcast, you know this, but a lot of people don't realize how expensive, valuable, whatever word you want to use, this pre-sales team is. So it's a considerable investment when you start talking about a dedicated pre-sales team for your business, because again, they're making six figures potentially, right? And so, however, they also have the potential to have one of the biggest impacts on you closing deals, right? So it's a trade-off. Just like anything in business is like, in order for this to be a worthwhile investment, I need to see some level of return. So if I'm investing $1 million into a team, a pre-sales team, I'm expecting $10 million of services revenue to come through. I think there's a metric. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'd probably misquote it. It might've been your quote. I don't know. But right. Like if you, so there's a lot. So just to say that it's an investment.
Down the right path.
Okay. Yeah.
You're heading down the right path. And excuse me. And you are right. There is a metric. There's a guideline. And this also is very dependent upon a number of factors. So as a rule of thumb, in the various organizations I've been in, and this has changed over time, when I first started, it was 1.1 million to an engineer. So that engineer should be able to produce, to a pre-sales engineer, they should be able to produce about 1.1 million in gross margin. But that was 15 years ago when the portfolios were not as robust, right? And where you could make margin on hardware. Sorry if anybody's listening that thinks
not the case anymore.
So, I mean, there are ways, but that's another podcast.
Oh, yeah.
But as our portfolios have grown and as services and other things have become relevant moneymakers, and managed services are now part of an organization where maybe they were outsourced before. And so there's some areas of opportunity where you can develop and create more margin. That number really has moved up to about 1.75, right? Wow. So I would say as of today, if you're not on average getting an engineer to produce about 1.75 in margin, and this can be on the larger side of an organization. It's not necessarily on the small side of. So if you've got an organization that's just 10 people, that's probably not a good number to use. You need to use a different metric. But as a rule of thumb, that's a good number to use. Now,
there's some ratio, right? There's some ratio of large organizations are probably paying more because they can afford more. However, they expect larger returns, to your point, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm sure we could probably back into the math of some sort of ratio there, but that's a great that's a great metric or benchmark at least to think about.
It's a great benchmark, and then you make adjustments, right? So as an example, if you're opening up a new market, and let's say you just landed one salesperson there, for this first year, you can't necessarily hold your pre-sales engineer to the same level of expectation because that salesperson's building their business, right? So you have to adjust. If you're bringing somebody who's a specialist on XYZ technology, that is a forward technology, it's a cutting edge technology. It's not something that everybody's capable of selling yet in a market. You got to make an adjustment. So there are all these very engineering answer. It depends scenarios.
Right. Yeah. There's nuance to it. Right. So, did you ever have some sort of matrix that you would use to try to distill all the stuff, with a couple of different, I don't know, I have this picture in my head, and again, I'm over engineering it as usual. Right. But yeah. So let's go back to measuring that team. I think that's probably a better path to go down. Right. So you're looking at return for the engineers. You're looking at potentially activity based on scoping, how many scopes, right? What are some of the other things that you've use to measure some teams?
Yeah. So I would say that there's a number of metrics that are more intangible than tangible.
Okay.
So one of the things that, again, depending on where you are in your trajectory, that you might want to consider would be what's the interaction between that engineer and other engineers, right? So usually what you find in an engineering organization, pre-sales, is that somebody has an expertise, and then you have somebody with a different expertise and a different expertise and so on, because you don't necessarily have to have a homogeneous team. It's really better to have a heterogeneous team oftentimes, because you're not just selling one technology, you're selling multiple. In most cases, if you're an OEM, it's a different thing. But
sure,
in our VAR communities and our SIN communities, this is typically the case where it's more heterogeneous. So one thing to do is, because you want to get part of what your sales strategy should be is, how much of my portfolio can I sell to an individual customer, right? It's once you acquire that customer, it's easier to sell them more than it is to go acquire another customer, as we all know, right?
Yep.
So how do I do that? Generally what happens, and I'm sure you've had this experience, John, where you're working with a client, you become the trusted SE, and that client then wants to hear from you, what other technology should they be considering? Or when they are considering other technology, they want to talk to you because you're their comfort.
Right.
So how do I make sure that John gets the support from the team in order to then go and do that? Well, you measure the interactions between the team members themselves, right? So there should be.
Are you doing that based on like association to a deal and kind of attribute, or attributing certain some level of attribution based on who's involved in the deal, or how are you measuring that kind of team involvement thing?
There's different levels to measure. So the first level is literally at a tactical level with the manager, the SE manager, to say, hey, John, are you and Mary going, how many engagements have you gone out together on, or how many times have you guys worked on a scope of work together, or how many quotes have you put out together? That's one way. Another way to do it is at either at a business unit level or at a more director level is what's your cross-pollination across technology pillars? So if, let's say, you sell 10% data center, 20% UC, and 50% wireless, how do I continue to change that metric to up the other product portfolios, right? To be more balanced, as an example. That comes through supporting, right, in an individual client, selling more across the entire spectrum of portfolio, which does generally require more SEs than one.
Yeah, and you could do something even as simple as like this comes into like account planning, right? And some of the things that you're doing for your existing customers is, hey, let's build a heat map. What are we currently selling into them? And again, maybe this was your idea, I don't know, but I found a heat map one day, right? And so we'd go through and talk about every single account, again, maybe our top accounts or something like that, and say, we're talking to them all day long about data center, cloud. We haven't touched security, we haven't touched collaboration. So to your point, maybe that's an opportunity to bring in another one of my team members that's really strong in collaboration to just have a conversation, go to lunch with a client and talk about stuff, right? Because that's how you start. Because again, more likely than not, that pre-sales team has a level of trust and relationship built with that account that maybe the sales team doesn't have yet. Right, or will never have. Who knows?
Yeah, well, and you could be in partnership with your sales team, and just to kind of, I'm sure everybody gets this who's watching. None of this is done in isolation, and all of this has to be done with accountability. Right, there has to be. You could make the best plan and say, here's all the metrics I'm going to measure you with, but if you don't hold people accountable, none of this really matters. So you have to build into your framework that requirement of accountability. And listen, a heat map is great. Account planning is awesome. Internal QBRs are necessary. All of this rigor around how do you manage to this whole, what we're talking about is really important. And what I found actually, quite honestly, is as you look at the key metrics, and I would go and share this with my competitors very freely, like, here's what we're doing. Because 9 times out of 10, what happens is the accountability and building rigor around things kind of gets lost because everybody's running so fast.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's just part of the world that we live in, and hence why you might want to bring in a consultant to help you.
Consultants
do those things.
Well, so all right. So I don't want people listening to this to get just overwhelmed because, again, we're talking about a lot of different things, right? And again, you and I have the benefit of having worked with each other, so I know what you're talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But what we like to do at the end of all these podcasts is ask our experts that are here, okay, we've talked about some really great things. What is one practical thing, two practical things that anyone listening can use today to change their business, right? Their services business. Like, what would you, in the vein of what we've been talking about, what would be one thing that you could kind of distill this all down to for us?
Yeah. I don't know if it'll be one thing.
Two. I'll give you
let's
two.
See if I can do. All right. Two things. First and foremost, you have to have executive alignment from executive to field. Okay. You got to figure out what is your go-to-market and create that vision that gets transferred from that executive team out to the field. Everybody should be on the same page. That's really important.
Okay.
That's first and foremost. Secondly, a very tactical thing that you can do is make sure that you have the right tools and process in place. People, specifically pre-sales engineers, sometimes can feel very abandoned because they're asked to do certain things with a certain type of process or tool set that they don't feel really accommodates the role that they're in. It doesn't really do what they're being asked to do. And you know, like, I'll stick to my summary, but you know, so make sure that you're asking for feedback from the field on what it is that they need. That's really important as you're building your pre-sales organization and as you're measuring them. Yeah. If you don't get the feedback, and you got to be willing to get the honest feedback. That is, I was going to say,
important. Don't let it be lip service where you ask for the feedback yet you never deliver on it, right? So again, I've seen you deliver on time and time again. Our team giving you feedback and giving your team feedback, and hey, lo and behold, it would happen, right? So like that's a big thing, and like the follow up, just so from someone providing the feedback, right? So it's huge. All right, well. Yeah. Look, Madick, again, I think we have about 3 or 4 episodes we could probably talk about here, but, you know.
I'm happy to come back.
No, I know, and we will have you back for sure. So, again, you're a seasoned veteran of the industry. You've been doing this for a long time. You know a lot about what's going on. And so if someone wants to reach out, talk to you, tell us a little bit about where they can find you now, what you're doing currently to help.
Yeah. Thanks, John. I appreciate that. And again, kudos to you and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today. And I hope that some of your audience takes away from this conversation some real tangible things. And if not, or if they want more information on some of the things, they can reach me at Stephen Madick at LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm a pretty big user of LinkedIn, so they can always send me a message or connect with me. And if for some reason they're not on LinkedIn or they don't want to do it that way, they can also reach out to me by Stephen at wifihotshots.com, which is WIFIHOTSHOTS.com. And I'm happy to support or help in any way that they need. And what I'm doing today is a couple of things. I am providing fractional CTO, COO, VP of engineering type services to your community, to our community, SIs and VARs and others alike. And I'm also consulting with and supporting Wi-Fi Hotshots. That is more than just Wi-Fi. They do all sorts of integration around the common core technology that we all grew up on, and they're a systems integrator. And I'm doing consulting work for them and helping them out. So I have an email with them, and it's a great place to find me as well.
Yeah, man. Well, again, thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for listening. You can subscribe to this podcast at scopestack.io/podcast, and it's on a number of different channels. So if you're not an Apple person, you can be a Spotify person or an Amazon or wherever, right? So there's a bunch of different options for you. So again, thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you soon. Have a good one. Bye.